super PAC backing 2024 Democratic presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. reportedly brought in more than $6 million in fundraising this July, with support from Democrats and Republicans, according to a press release from the super PAC American Values 2024. The super PAC says it raised $6.46 million last month, which has brought its total amount raised for Kennedy thus far to $16.82 million. Some of the backers of the PAC include GOP mega donor Timothy Mellon and Gavin DeBecker, who is a security consultant to Jeff Bezos, as well as other celebrities.
Mellon said in the press release, "The fact that Kennedy gets so much bipartisan support tells me two things: that he's the one candidate who can unite the country and root out corruption, and that he's the one Democrat who can win in the general election." Now, according to Rolling Stone, American Values 2024 received more than 50% of its funding from Mellon. Obviously, this is the Mellon family of the former Treasury Secretary from a long time ago was a Mellon, and et cetera. What do you make of the fact that RFK Jr. has a prominent, very wealthy Republican backer?
Money talks.
Yeah.
And many disenfranchised voters, many independent voters have been drawn to various campaigns, whether it's Donald Trump's initial 2016 campaign or Bernie Sanders' 2016 or 2020 runs, because they realize that corruption is an enormous issue in American politics. Even though we have different politics, you frequently articulate a belief that I share, which is that the influence of money in politics has corrupted government in important ways. We look at the connection between lobbying dollars and what the government actually pursues versus what polls show us the shared interests of overwhelming majorities of Americans are. And we understand that it's the negative influence of money in politics that have created that gap between what Americans want and what Congress is willing to do. And the same thing plays out in campaign finance. There's no such thing as a free lunch. That's something conservatives say a lot when we're talking about social benefits, welfare, what have you. And I think we have to bring that same scrutiny, if you have that position, bring that same scrutiny to these campaign donations and ask what is being asked for in exchange for these donations. Someone like Bernie Sanders, I would argue, was able to have the policy platform that he had that differed so much from the rest of the Democratic Party field and Republicans because he rejected all corporate funding and all billionaire donations. Are we going to be able to see a genuinely populist candidate in someone like RFK Jr. if they're not only taking corporate money, generally speaking, which many on the left take issue with, but specifically money from a conservative who's been giving historically to conservatives who have interests that are not shared by a majority of Democratic voters or even a majority of American voters as a whole, because unsurprisingly, billionaire interests don't typically align with the interests of working class people.
I know a lot of mainstream Democrats who think to some degree, the conservative support or the support from Elon Musk type people and Mellon, et cetera, of RFK Jr. is some cynical attempt to undermine Biden to help the Republican nominee, Trump or whoever it might be. That sounds kind of like a conspiracy theory to me. Like, what is the argument? How is this actually hurting Biden all that much? Let's assume Biden eventually gets the nomination over RFK Jr. and Marianne Williamson, which, you know, they should debate. There should be an actual campaign, but according to the poll numbers, is overwhelmingly likely. How was Joe Biden actually hurt by all of this? I think these people probably sincerely, they want to show some support for, they sincerely appreciate some of the ideas RFK Jr. is injecting into the campaign. Not all of them, but some of them, and they're giving him some support. It's just a plot to hurt Biden. I'm not sure how in the long run it actually hurts him.
Well, I'm personally less concerned about how much RFK Jr. hurts Biden than whether or not they're giving him the money because he genuinely is going to advance some of their specific interests if he were to win the nomination. You know, the Mellon fella didn't give to Trump out of the goodness of his heart. He gave to Trump likely because they were very aligned on, for example, a border wall. Now, if you support a border wall, then you are perhaps not upset by the idea that RFK Jr. would align with someone like this, but the Democratic Party has been vilifying the idea of a border wall since Trump stepped on the scene, and it would be a very interesting pivot if suddenly he was able to generate support among the very group that has been characterizing building such a wall as human rights issue in something akin to legitimate racism. Mellon has also been very dismissive of kind of fundamental bedrock welfare social programs that, again, have been the bread and butter of the Democratic Party that's positioned itself as offering support for poor and working people in a way that the GOP has not historically. So, there's a legitimate conflict of interest that is presented when someone takes money from someone who does not share the interests of their purported constituents. And there have also been some discrete moments people have pointed to in the actual interactions and conversations between someone like RFK Jr. and Elon Musk on the Twitter launch call and things like that, where his kind of gratuitous praise of certain aspects of Elon Musk's business and his acumen and his quote-unquote genius have caused some to wonder whether or not he can be critical of Elon Musk when he fails. If Elon Musk does not have transparency on his own Twitter/X app, is that something that a candidate who takes so much money from someone is willing to follow up on and press him on? Ron DeSantis got into trouble for having, I think, a similar interaction with one of these big funders, where right after he received funding from one of these billionaire tech people, I'm not sure if it was Musk or Sachs or whatever, there was an advantageous change in a Florida law for that very group. So there's no proof oftentimes of explicit pay-to-play, but generally speaking, the American public has been smart enough to know that nobody gives millions of dollars to a campaign out of the goodness of their heart without some expectation that it's going to benefit them personally in the longer run.
Well, right. There's a very direct kind of, where corruption just becomes trying to influence things for the policies you think are better. It can be a little bit of a not clear boundary, right? I guess if you're giving because you want a specific subsidy for your industry or a specific regulatory tweak that helps your firm so specifically, we would all call that corruption. It may or may not be legal, depending on exactly how the rules are written. Conservatives, they give money at the wealthy level and at the normal person level to support policies that they think are going to be better for them and their families and their neighbors, et cetera. And Democrats do the same. And I think it's different when you're voting or you're wanting someone to specifically enrich you very directly, but in some sense, the vote and the support that everyone does is
yes, it's
trying to show solidarity for policies you think are better for you and for everybody else.
We're all voting and we're all donating to candidacies that are going to help us. The problem is, and why people want limits on campaign funding, is that if I'm one person with my one vote, but I only make $50,000 a year, and Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk are the richest men in the world, and they can contribute to PACs.
They still only get one vote, too.
But they can contribute to PACs with no limits on their contributions and spending, then suddenly it's not looking like one person, one vote. It's looking like I can give my 27 donation to the populist candidate that wants to raise the minimum wage, and Bezos or one of those other kinds of people can spend unlimitedly on PACs and independent contributions to put any number of television ads and to buy any number of yard signs and to do absolutely the maximum to make sure their candidate wins. And is that democracy? Is that fair?
It's persuasion. Still only get one vote at the end of the day.
Well, a majority of Americans want campaign finance reform for exactly this reason. In fact, I think that one of the last people to take it really seriously in a political context was John McCain, who was surprised and frustrated when the seeming bipartisan agreement that he had with Barack Obama during the race to support campaign finance reform evaporated once Obama won the primary and realized that he was a historically able campaign fundraiser and didn't want to fight with one hand tied behind his back, as it were. But Americans still, I think, very viscerally understand, in the same way they understand these broader corruption issues in government, that ordinary working people, are really at a disadvantage when you have three people who have more wealth than the bottom half of Americans and have an expectation that campaign contributions from both of those groups are going to have an equal effect in our democracy.
Sure, but there's a lot. RFK Jr. thinks that his ability to speak on all of these platforms, reaching, huge, massive. Should there be some kind of redistribution or equal time thing like Joe Rogan's obligated to have on Joe Biden and Marianne Williamson and Tim Scott and everybody else to, make it fair how much airtime they're getting?
No, I don't think that sort of an equal time rule is perhaps even is necessary or perhaps even permissible. I do think
it's not constitutional, but that's what the Supreme Court said about a lot of the spending limits, that at the end of the day, that's speech, and you can't regulate it in the same way.
I do think that is notable for someone like Elon Musk, who's holding himself out as impartial and fair, and who explicitly said he was happy to hold Twitter Spaces for any presidential candidate, to have repeatedly ignored Marianne Williamson's taking up that offer, repeatedly ignored apparently requests that she's made directly to the campaign and very publicly on Twitter immediately after he held out the offer. And I do think that voters should keep in mind when they're choosing between candidates whether or not the media that we know is biased in all the ways that we described regularly is having an outsized effect on who they think is viable, who they should be paying attention to. And that's not just a mainstream kind of corporate media reality. Sometimes independent media can have its thumb on the scale, which they have every right to do, but it just makes it a harder barrier for voters to overcome, to really be able to see objectively for themselves which candidate actually is most committed to advancing their interests, not just the candidate that happens to pique Elon Musk's interest enough to get such a huge platform.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. No disagreement there. More Rising right after this.